Dr. Judy Cohen is a board-certified child psychiatrist and medical director for the Center for Traumatic Stress in Children and Adolescents at Allegheny General Hospital of Pittsburgh. She is co-developer of TFCBT, described in treating trauma and traumatic grief in children and adolescents. She is a consultant for Sesame Workshop's Talk, Listen, Connect, and the Tragedy Assistance Program for Survivors. Dr. Renee Dominguez is a licensed clinical psychologist and the assistant program director of Chicago Child Trauma Center at La Rabida Children's Hospital. She oversees the program evaluation of the CCTC, supervises interns and postdoctoral fellows on their provision of trauma-focused services, and continues to evaluate and treat children who have experienced trauma. Lynn Schwatsky is Vice President of Outreach Initiatives and Partners and is responsible for overseeing the execution of various Sesame Workshop initiatives that reach beyond television into local communities, schools, health, and child care settings to address the unmet needs of children and the people who care for children. She is also responsible for developing and maintaining key relationships with project advisors and strategic partners to help guide projects from their inception. Currently, she oversees Sesame's Military Families Project, a bilingual multimedia initiative providing resources and support to military families with young children. Dr. Robin Goodman is a licensed clinical psychologist and art therapist. Currently, she is director of the A Caring Hand, the Billy Esposito Foundation Bereavement Program, and consultant to Allegheny General Hospital Center for Traumatic Stress in Children and Adolescents. Prior to ACH, she was Director of Family Programs, Voices of September 11th, and consulted to the Department of Defense, Educational Opportunities Directorate, and National Child Traumatic Stress Network. Dr. Andrew Laurier is a licensed psychologist and has been the program manager of Highmark Caring Place, a center for grieving children, adolescents, and their families in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania since 1998. She has presented on a range of topics related to children's grief and models for grieving children and families. She brings 20 years of experience in child assessment, research, and clinical and peer support interventions for children and families, and is certified by the Association of Deaf Education and Counseling. I am pleased to hand over today's presentation to Dr. Cohen.
Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the NCTSN's Child Traumatic Grief Committee, I'm honored to welcome you to today's webinar. And it is especially timely that we're talking to you today because the holiday season serves as a reminder for many children that their parent, sibling, or other important person is not here with them. Even for children for whom holidays are a family time of happy anticipation, and even for those who have been coping well with the death, the coming days during the holiday season may include many sad and painful moments as children miss the person and their place in the holiday traditions. Older children are able to understand that the person will never be here to celebrate with them again. In addition, some children may face special challenges. Besides feeling sad about the death, these children experience what we call traumatic grief. Dr. Dominguez will be discussing this in detail in a few moments, but I would like to begin this webinar by introducing you to a little 7-year-old girl whom I will call Julia. Julia and her mother and her 5-year-old brother and her 3-year-old brother were playing in the front yard with Julia when a car suddenly backed up, came into their yard, and ran over Julia's youngest brother. What happened was a teenager had been driving, and the teenager accidentally put the car into reverse instead of drive. Julia's mother was just a couple feet away from her youngest brother, and she frantically ran to try to grab her son away before the car got to her son. She almost got run over in the process. And this teenager panicked when everybody started screaming and tried to move the car, but instead the car got stuck on this child. Everybody was screaming, and a panic and chaos ensued. The neighbors heard and called 911. By the time the EMTs arrived, the child was bleeding profusely, and they could not revive the child. Julia witnessed this entire event. She believed that the accident was her fault. She developed an omen that she should have known that playing in the yard close to where cars went by would be dangerous. And since she was the oldest child and should have known about safe versus dangerous situations, she believed that she should have been the one to die rather than her baby brother. She developed sleep problems, and she started having nightmares in which she saw her mother dying by violent death. Usually, Julia looked forward to Christmas, but the year that her brother died, she didn't want to celebrate it. Whenever she thought of Christmas, it reminded her of her brother and how they used to celebrate together, and her nightmares became even worse. And what she said was, the church people talked about, quote, the man who died, by which she meant Jesus. And this made Julia even more scared and made her think about the possibility that her mother would die. And this made her worry even more. Julia had what we call traumatic grief. She was especially bothered because her surviving younger brother didn't seem to have these problems. He liked to look at pictures and reminisce about their younger brother, and he wanted to talk about him. Julia couldn't stand when her mother and brother looked at these pictures and talked about their younger brother. She got very angry when this happened because it made her feel even guiltier about his death. And it made her feel like she was all alone in her grief and in her guilt. She felt like no one could understand her or what she was going through. We do not want children like Julia to travel their difficult journeys alone. Today we're joined not only by our NCTSN partners, but by Sesame Workshop and by our wonderful community partner, the Highmark Caring Place. The Caring Place has initiated Children's Grief Awareness Day, a terrific day to increase awareness and understanding about grieving children across the world. Today we are going to talk about a variety of resources specifically for children experiencing typical grief and traumatic grief and for their caregivers. We want every child who has experienced the death of an important person and for all of their parents to know you are not alone. Now we are going to hear from Dr. Dominguez, who is going to talk about children, grief, and traumatic grief. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Judy. I am going to, hello everyone, good afternoon. I'm going to be talking today about children, grief, and childhood traumatic grief, like Judy just said. I'm going to be starting off by talking about some of the common challenges for children when it comes to grieving, both ones that are sort of externally imposed on them and then ones that are more internally driven. Then I'll be talking about some of the core grieving tasks in which children engage over the course of their process. Next, I'll be talking about some of the common grief reactions that children have, along with some of the myths that are out there about children and grief. And there are many. Lastly, I'll be talking about childhood traumatic grief and really the way in which trauma and grief intersect to make this already difficult process more challenging for children. Next slide, please. Nobody really likes to talk about death. As a culture, we're pretty uncomfortable with this topic, and our discomfort is expressed in ways in which we talk about death, in the language that we use. People avoid saying the words death, dying, and dead. Here are a few examples that come to mind when I think about the language we use to try and minimize the impact, probably for ourselves and for the children. Instead of saying death, dying, and dead, we sometimes might say, or you hear people say, someone is gone, so Grandpa's gone. Grandpa left us. Grandpa expired. Grandpa's sleeping. Grandpa passed. I lost my grandpa. You can probably think of a dozen more off the top of your head, words that are used instead of saying death, dying, and dead. And when you think about it, it can be really confusing to kids. I lost my grandpa. Kids are very literal and concrete. Where did he go? Is he coming back? It just can create more confusion for kids. So our use of language and the coding of the language to conceal this harsh concept of death, dying, and dead can just complicate this already difficult topic. Despite our attempts at concealing the harsh realities of death, kids are exposed to death on a regular basis. They see insects dying outside when they're playing. They see animals hit by cars, roadkill. They see, they turn the TV on and they'll see death. So it's everywhere, and they do get exposed to it, even though we try and protect them from this harsh reality. About 10 years ago, I went to this day-long seminar to learn more about children's understanding of death. And the speaker, whose name was Darcy Sims, presented the audience with a wonderful picture of the typical American family as they address death. She emphasized that we're a country with lots of different cultures, and she found this picture that really captures American families' attitude towards death. Next slide, please. We don't want to see it, we don't want to hear about it, and we don't want to talk about it. Excuse me. Next slide, please. So in addition to kids getting coded messages about death from the media, from parents, from just people all over, their cognitive developmental level also impacts their understanding of death and may make it even more complicated for them, especially younger children. So children under the age of about 7 have a difficult time with these 3 concepts on this slide that I have here. First, I want to talk about functionality. Kids have a hard time understanding that all living functions cease at death, basically that the body stops working. So the heart stops beating, the brain stops working, people stop breathing, thinking, talking. Young children have a very difficult time sort of wrapping their brains around that concept. They just developmentally can't do it. Second, irreversibility. People can't come back to life. Again, this is particularly challenging for young children. When is Daddy coming back? They can ask that over and over and over because they don't quite understand that it's permanent and it's not, that Daddy's not coming back. Third, universality, inevitability. Everyone dies and it's going to happen. Kids have a really hard time understanding that as well. Young kids in particular. Usually about 9 or 10 kids can wrap their brains around these concepts, but younger, they have a much more difficult time understanding death, although that does not mean that they don't grieve. Next slide, please. This is a slide about common emotional responses. We all know this, but just to kind of sum up a few of the common emotional responses that children have when someone dies. They can experience numbing, sadness, yearning, missing the deceased person, wishing they were there. I have reminiscing on here, and I shouldn't because that's really not an emotion. We'll talk more about that later. Separation anxiety, fear of separating from loved ones, anxiety about other people dying. I think this is the case especially when the child's parents or one of their primary attachment figures is the one who died. Kids become much more anxious about separation in those circumstances. Certainly regression across lots of different domains. There might be bedwetting, there might be baby talk, there might be more needy, more clingy, just increase their need for support and love and contact. Essentially they step back in functioning at that time. And certainly anger. That goes without saying. Kids can experience anger, that someone they love died. It's a very common reaction. Next slide, please. So I'm going to take a few minutes here and talk about different bereavement tasks. And I'll just go through them one at a time and talk about them. The first task listed here is acceptance of reality and the permanence of death. Really, this is the first thing that needs to happen. In order to get to this place, children need to be provided with accurate information about the physical process of death. So the things that we talked about a little bit earlier. That the body doesn't work anymore. The heart's not beating, the brain's not working. They can also be provided with the basic information about the story of the deceased person's death. How, when, by what means. This information is crucial. It's a crucial beginning part of the grieving process and should be provided, in a developmentally appropriate way. Also, when there's a violent death, great consideration needs to be taken in determining what information is appropriate to give. You don't want to give too much information to the child, but certainly they need enough to know what happened. So another bereavement task, the second one listed here is self-protection. And really, kids need to feel safe to take the emotional risk of grieving. So to help them to feel safe, it's important to address their fears with accurate and honest information. And it can be helpful to reassure children that they're safe. Again, especially in the case of a parent or primary attachment figure who has died. Reassuring the child that they're safe and that their caregiver is safe, their current caregiver is safe, making healthy choices, trying to stay healthy to live a long and healthy life can be really reassuring for the child and can help them to experience more of the grief tasks. The third one listed here is emotional acceptance. Once the child feels safe and protected, the child can begin to experience the emotional realization of all that is lost. So they can actually begin to feel the loss of not being able to see, to talk to touch the deceased person again. They can actually sort of at an emotional level begin to experience that risk. The fourth thing I have listed here is the reevaluation of the relationship as a bereavement task. And that really involves recalling positive and negative experiences of the deceased and really trying to resolve some of the ambivalence and finding a way to remain connected to the individual who's died. This can happen very nicely within the context of a family, telling stories, looking at pictures, videos, and just really remembering the person who has died. The fifth bereavement task I have listed here, and again, this isn't in any specific order, but the fifth one that I have listed here is bearing the pain. And I think that happens slowly and tentatively and intermittently over time. It's important to let the child know that it's okay to do this, to support that process. And I think it's best done within the context of a loving and supportive family or group of friends who allow the child to remember and feel the loss and share that loss with them. Next slide, please. A few more bereavement tasks here. Forming a new sense of personal identity. This is really about the way in which the child may incorporate the deceased person into their own sense of self. The child may identify something in the person who died and see it in themselves, or they may want to see it in themselves, and they work to build up that part of himself or herself. So really taking that person and trying to incorporate memories of that person and part of that person into their own identity. The next bereavement task that I'm going to talk about is investing in new relationships. Children really may initially avoid doing this because they're afraid of another loss. I guess I should say they're afraid that someone else will die. So as they move through grief, they do more of this. They open up to this idea and they start to take that emotional risk and they start to invest in new relationships. And that's just part of that bereavement task. The third bereavement task I have listed on this page here in the slide is the constructing a durable internal relationship. And I think of this one really as one of the primary end goals of the grieving process. Of course, there's not really an end to grief, but I like to think about this as a place to really try and get to. Grief should not be a way to detach emotionally, but really a way to form a new kind of attachment. The child can find a way to remember the person who died that recognizes the absence of the person but incorporates that deceased person into the child's self. This allows for a new kind of inner presence that comforts them. Certainly this can be facilitated with different remembrance activities, and certainly in the context of a loving and supportive family that can be very helpful. Returning to developmental tasks, the next bereavement task that I have listed here, a profound loss, a death, can interrupt development, and getting back on track and picking up where kids left off is another important bereavement task, another important goal, really, for kids to be able to get back on track and pick up where they left off. Making meaning of death, another bereavement task that I have listed here. This is typically something that happens later in the grieving process, but can make life so much more bearable for the child. Oftentimes, this is done in the context of a larger spiritual framework and can be very, very healing. Lastly, I have here coping with the periodic resurgence of pain. The grieving process doesn't really end. There's no real end to it. Pain will come and go and tends to come more frequently and more strongly around anniversaries. And as Judy said in the introduction, around holidays and around, special times that children may have spent with the deceased, and they're no longer there to spend them with them. So pain will come and go, and it tends to come more frequently around anniversaries, around firsts, the first birthdays after the death, the first Thanksgiving after the death. And with kids, also as they move through different developmental transitions through life, whether it's, grade school graduation or middle school graduation or high school graduation, prom, even through adult life, marriages and kids, that grief process doesn't end. So for kids, really, and adults, coping with the periodic resurgence of pain is an ongoing bereavement task that doesn't really end. Again, it's probably done best within the context of loving and supportive family and friends who can support this process and allow it to happen. Next slide, please. Myths about children and grief. These are some more ideas that came from that Darcy Sims woman who spoke at that conference I went to like 10 years ago. These are really commonly held beliefs, and I wanted to underscore that they're just myths. People often believe this, and I just wanted to put it out there. I thought she made some really good points in this, and I wanted to pass that along. The first thing here is children don't understand death, therefore they don't grieve. Complete myth. Even when children are younger and they have a cognitive and developmental limitations about death, they still grieve. They still feel the absence of that person and are emotionally impacted by the death. So that's a myth. Everyone grieves the same way in a logical and orderly progression. Again, myth. While there are some tasks that need to come earlier in the process, grief is not a stepwise process. Not everyone does it the same way in the same order. So that's a myth as well. Infants and toddlers don't grieve. Myth, yes they do. They feel the absence and the loss. They feel the death. They feel that emotional loss. They do grieve. Childhood bereavement always leads to a maladjusted adult life. No, that's a myth. Kids heal, particularly within the context of a supportive relationship that allows and facilitates the healing process, the grieving process. Next slide, please. Here's a few more myths about children and grief. Speaking of the deceased will reopen the child's grief wounds. That's a myth. I have heard that so many times. I was actually in a session yesterday, and a mom was saying that yesterday in session. I heard that quite a bit. It's a myth. It's really just the opposite. In contrast, talking about the person who died can be very helpful in the grieving process. It communicates that it's okay to remember. Second, children should be protected and shielded from the pain of grief. Myth, again. Children are going to grieve. Trying to protect them and shield them from this process can just complicate it instead of facilitate it and support it. Children cope with grief more easily if they have lots of activities. It's a myth. While we want children to be able to engage in the business of being children and getting back on track developmentally, distracting them with lots of activities to try and cope with the grief can be avoidant and counterproductive. We want to support the grief process, not avoid it. Next slide, please. Okay, now I'm going to talk a little bit about childhood traumatic grief as well. So, childhood traumatic grief is death of a significant person in circumstances perceived as traumatic. And really, it's the interaction and presence of significant PTSD reactions and symptoms with grief. And that it impinges on the ability to engage in tasks associated with bereavement. So this can be a wide range of circumstances. It's the perception that the death is traumatic that makes it complicating. So the kids that I work with who have childhood traumatic grief are typically kids who've experienced loss or violent death. So most of them do have this complicated traumatic grief presentation. But that's a pretty extreme circumstances, and child traumatic grief reactions can occur in other contexts as well. It just goes back to sort of that perception that the death is traumatic. Okay, so next slide, please. Just kind of reiterating what I said. Because memories of the deceased are associated with memories of the traumatic event, healthy reminiscing can lead to trauma responses. So a child may be remembering a special time that the child spent with the person who died and can be triggered, and that can disrupt the healthy reminiscing process. Fear responses take priority over sadness, such that if a memory is associated with both fear and sadness in the context of a child who's experiencing traumatic grief, fear is going to take priority, and it's going to interfere with the grief process. Normal feelings of guilt, anxiety, and anger are exacerbated and may be overwhelming. These get intensified and can overwhelm coping resources. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is the last part of the talk that I'm going to be doing here today. These slides came from the Courage to Remember curriculum guidelines. You can see the little reference on the bottom of the slide. And we're going to take a look right now at how the bereavement tasks of a sort of normal, relatively normal, adaptive, typical process looks that we talked about already, and sort of line that up with, so that's on the left side of the slide, and then line that up with the right side of the slide that captures ways in which kids who are experiencing child traumatic grief might not be able to have that adaptive grief response. So let's look at this first one, accepting the reality and permanence of death. In a child who is experiencing childhood traumatic grief, they may have difficulty or an unwillingness to accept that the person has died due to associations of the death with a traumatic circumstance. it's just too hard to even believe. They can't, it's so overwhelming, and they just can't wrap their brain around it. They just cannot get to acceptance. So the circumstances make it so difficult that they can't even do that sort of first initial task, that acceptance that has actually happened. Secondly, experience and cope with difficult emotional reactions. In a child who's experiencing childhood traumatic grief, he or she may not be able to do this because he or she may be triggered by reminders of the traumatic way in which the person died, which can be too intense to tolerate and may lead to avoidance of the feeling instead. So there's a way that the child can't bear the pain, sit and bear the pain, and experience that emotional grieving process. Next slide, please. Let's see. Adjust to changes in their lives and changes in their identity that result from death. In a child who's experiencing childhood traumatic grief, changes lead to unpleasant reminders of the way in which the person died. Change in itself can be a trigger, thereby making it difficult to adjust. Children who are experiencing childhood traumatic grief may also over-identify with the person who died in a way that interferes with their own healthy identity development. Developing new relationships or deepening existing ones. In a child who's experiencing traumatic grief, feelings such as guilt, anger, and revenge interfere with forming new relationships. Also, when children get stuck in the traumatic grief and they don't feel particularly safe, they're also more reluctant to take emotional risk of engaging in relationships. So they might not put themselves out there and engage with people. Next slide, please. Maintaining a continuing healthy attachment to the deceased person through remembrance activities. So, in a child who's experiencing childhood traumatic grief, he may avoid the positive memories because they're linked to the horrible images, upsetting thoughts and feelings. Again, there's a way that this healthy reminiscing is interrupted because the child is triggered by the memory of the traumatic circumstances. It just interferes. The child cannot engage in the healthy bereavement task if she's being triggered. It interferes, and it makes it impossible to engage in that grief process, in that bereavement task. The next one is find some meaning in the death and learning about oneself. In a child who's experiencing traumatic grief, again, he or she can't move past terrifying, unpleasant aspects of the death to be able to make a meaning of it instead of focus on how could this happen. It's so horrific. It just doesn't make sense. You know, how could this happen? And they can't get past it to find meaning. And they just kind of get stuck and can't get through those bereavement tasks. Next page, please. This is the last one. Continue through the normal developmental stages. Children experiencing childhood traumatic grief can have emotional reactions and resulting behavior like withdrawal, anger, distrust that can interfere with the ability to engage in positive, age-appropriate activities and relationships. Really, this process can be derailing, and it can throw kids off course and just really make it difficult for them to grieve and go through those developmental stages. So at this point, I just want to say one more thing. I wanted to say that for professionals who are working with children who experience childhood traumatic grief, I think it's really important to provide basic psychoeducation about the interaction between grief and trauma to the child and the families. I've heard so many people say, I just feel like I'm going crazy. It's just not normal. And it's important for them to know that while childhood traumatic grief is not a typical grief reaction, you know that they're not going crazy and that they can be helped. And I think addressing that up front and directly with them is just really important to start when working with these families. So that's what I have to say today. Now we'll be moving on to the next speaker. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Renee, for that wonderful presentation. Now we're going to hear from Lynn Schwatzky, who will be talking about the terrific Sesame Workshop resources for young children and their caregivers.
Thank you, Judy, and thank you, Renee. That was just perfect for segueing into my work. It's an honor to be here today. Thank you for having me, Judy and team. And before I begin, I'm sure some of you on this call are wondering, Sesame Street and When Families Grieve, what does this have to do with Sesame Street? We're probably known to most of you as the TV show that has been on the air for 42 years. I'm actually not a part of the TV series. I'm actually part of what we call the Educational Outreach Group. And what we do is we identify a need in a target audience, and we figure out how the combination of these furry, fuzzy, and friendly Muppets can mix with media and how we can use those two to reach a need in this target audience. So if you can go to the next slide, please. The need. So just before I go into the need for this work, why we actually undertook work around grief is based on previous work that we did helping support military families. Since 2006, we have provided resources and tools to our youngest service members, our preschool-age children, to help them cope with some difficult times in their lives, specifically around deployments and when a parent returns home injured with either a physical injury or an invisible injury. And based on that work, we really felt that there was a need to really help military children cope with the death of a parent, which we know is an unfortunate consequence of the current wars that we're in. But as you can see from the need slide, and most of you on this already are aware of this, while we realized there was a need with military kids, we also realized there was a need with kids in the general population. And again, Renee just did such a beautiful job telling us that there really truly is a need to help all children, because this is inevitable. This is something that children are going to have happen in their lives. And we thought, this is something we could be doing, and this is something we should be doing. Now, most of you on the phone are probably saying, oh, I remember Sesame Street many years ago after Mr. Hooper died. He was actually a real human on the show, and he actually died. And there were producers, there were writers, there were cast members that were struggling with the death of this man, and we thought, if we're struggling with it, we're sure the audience that is watching the show is struggling with it. And we actually produced a special television show around Mr. Hooper's death. And that show was done many years ago. It was a beautiful show, but we realized that this was something that we need to relook at and see if there's any reason to update it, to make it more current, and to address anything that may not have been addressed in this show. We also really wanted to see beyond TV how we could address the death of a parent, the death of a loved one. So next slide, please. So again, what could we do? What could these powerful Muppets, I joke with everybody, Elmo is 3.5. He was 3.5 years ago. He will be 3.5 in 3.5 years, and 12 years, and 20 years. But the beauty of Elmo, and for those of you who have children or grandchildren or yourselves were Elmo fans or were Elmo fans, you know how much Elmo resonates with young kids. And the reason is because he talks like a 3.5-year-old. He feels like a 3.5-year-old, and he behaves like a 3.5-year-old. Kids idolize, and parents idolize this Muppet. And what we have seen over time is kids mimic or model, Elmo models behaviors for children. So we thought, wow, could you imagine if Elmo was grieving the death of somebody very close to him and going through all that Renee talked about, the confusion, the uncertainty, the I'm sure I will see him again type of situations. Could you imagine for children who are going through the grief of a loved one or grieving the death of a loved one, how this could benefit those children? So what we thought was, let's set out goals for this project. And as you can see here, it's to reduce the levels of anxiety, sadness, and confusion children experience following the death of a parent, to provide tools to support children and the adult caregivers through the grief process. This was a biggie. And what we realized was, while this project is for kids, this is really about speaking to a dual audience. This is about speaking to young children and the grown-ups in their lives, whether it's their surviving adults, whether it's their grandparents, whether it's their teachers or their caregivers. This is a dual message. This is not a plop your child in front of the TV to watch something while you need 10 minutes to make dinner. This is a co-viewing experience And we also realized that, believe it or not, even though we were targeting young children, there is real power and real comfort and security when the Muppets are going through some of these difficult times. And as silly as it sounds, it really has shown that that it works, that it does really well communicating to both children and the adults in their lives. And they'll often reassure the children that they are loved and safe, and who better than their friends on Sesame Street to do that. And, you know, I think we, again, as I said, what we didn't realize as much going into this was how powerful this could be for the parents. That when the parents have the right words and the right tools to engage in a dialogue with their children, they are better. They feel better knowing that they can help their children. And it is amazing where you see the comfort in having Elmo deliver some really tough messages. If Elmo can do it, I can do it, and I can use Elmo as a way to help this, to help guide this. Just so you, in terms of a process, you know, what we know here at Sesame is we know Muppets and we have an understanding of children. What we really didn't know was the real true process of an understanding of death and how kids process it and how adults process it. So what we did was we had an advisory board get together of leading experts in this area, one of which is Dr. Cohen, and we sat for a day and a half just going through all of this, going through all of what Renee just went through to really fully understand it. And then to be able to take that and distill that into appropriate messaging for kids and in sort of ways that only the Muppets can deliver this messaging. In addition, we talked to families. We talked to parents through focus groups. We really wanted to hear it from them and make sure what we were planning on doing was appropriate for them. Next slide, please. So what did we deliver? What we created, what we call our Bilingual Outreach Kits. This is a nice compact kit in English and in Spanish that contains several things. One is a DVD with an original Muppet story. As I mentioned, Elmo's uncle, Uncle Louie, has died. Elmo is struggling. You know, he misses Uncle Louie, and he makes some comment like, okay, well, when I see him later, and Elmo's dad has to sort of tell him that he will never see Uncle Louie again. But Elmo's cousin Jessie is struggling, and Jessie's dad, of course, was Louie. And it's this wonderful story of how Elmo struggles, uses his sort of friends on Sesame Street to get through this struggle, and then the strategies that he learns from them, he employs with his cousin Jessie. And it's about the whole community coming together and really supporting each other and answering some really difficult topics and questions that young children go through around this situation. But in addition to this Muppet story, we also have live-action family docus. We have documentaries of 4 families. Each have gone through a different sort of, if you want to say, type of death. One is the illness, a long-term illness, the death of a mother due to cancer. One is a combat-related death. Dad was in the Army, died in Iraq. One was a sudden tragedy. Dad was a firefighter and had a massive heart attack in his early 40s, about to go out on a call. And the last is a death by suicide. So we combine the video footage of the Muppets as well as these family docus to really deliver a rich video experience for both kids and grown-ups. In addition, we created print materials, a parent caregiver guide for the adults. This not only teaches them how to use these materials, but also extends the learning beyond our materials. We know we are not the end-all, be-all, so we know that there are many other resources out there, but we also know that beyond watching these videos and using these print materials, there are more things that families can do together. And then there's this wonderful children's storybook. If you see the bottom right image, it's called Something Small, a story about remembering, and it's a beautiful illustrated story featuring the Muppets for young children. In addition, we had a 1-hour television show, which was on PBS. Katie Clark was the host of it, and as most of you know, she was perfect for this because Katie's husband died when her children were young, and she gave a wonderful perspective to this topic and really was able to engage with families and the Muppets very well. You can see what we did. We produced 380,000 of these kits specifically for the military and 650,000 of these for sort of the general public. And those are being distributed. Actually, if you go to the next slide, please. So this material is being distributed in various ways. A big thing for us is through digital means. We know that many people are online or getting this information through the web and obviously through social media. So you can tell what we did here. We have it on our website. We have it on our YouTube channel. Of course, it's through Facebook and Twitter. Some of our partners have this content as well, and we are continuing to find media platforms, especially digital media platforms that distribute this content. The military distribution, as you see here, we try to work with as many possible networks as possible within the military to get these resources. What's interesting about this topic is we need to get these resources to these families and to these people. This is, not really something that we felt that parents are going to say, oh, wait, I want to request this. I'd like to get a copy of this. So we tried as much as possible to push these materials out, specifically to those people, those who are providing support and resources to families who are coping with the death of a loved one. And the same thing, of course, through our non-military distribution as well, as you can see here, through, hospitals and professional organizations, etc. So the next slide is actually what I thought the power of really our work is in video. So I have a short video that is a little bit of a summary of our grief work, and I was hoping we could run the clip. I do warn everybody that you should probably have a tissue nearby because still after all these times it does even make me cry. So if we could run the video clip and then I'll come back after the clip, please.
I'm drawing on my wall. I like drawing flowers because my mom really liked flowers and she really liked purple, so I imagine them sometimes as purple. My dad thought it's a really good way to get your emotions out and help you just feel better. My mom was pretty and she was very smart and she looked relatively. And she had to cut her hair because she had breast cancer.
We're about to talk about a subject that's really hard to talk about. It's a topic that's very sensitive and emotional, but unfortunately affects many people, the death of a loved one.
My dad was a soldier.
I didn't have the heart to really tell them that their dad was not going to come home. My mother did it for me. She sat them all down on a bed. She told them, she said, your dad's not coming home. And my son said, why, Grandma? And they're like, because your daddy was killed in Iraq.
Hello, it's so good to see you. It's been so long. I've missed your red furry face.
Well, it's good to see Miss Katie, too.
I thought your cousin Jessie was coming with you.
Oh, she'll be here soon.
Oh, good, because I wanted to see how you two were doing, because I heard you had some sad news in your family.
Yeah, Elmo's Uncle Jack died.
I'm so sorry to hear that, Elmo.
Oh, well, here's a picture of him.
Oh,
see?
There's Uncle Jack, and he is your dad, Louie's brother, right?
Yeah, Cousin Jessie's daddy.
Oh, this is such a nice picture, Elmo.
Yeah, Elmo really misses Uncle Jack.
Yeah, my brother. Oh, he sure did love baseball.
Yeah.
And he loved teaching you how to play. He was so proud of you that day, he gave you the cap right off his head.
Yeah. Wait, Elmo can't wait to see Uncle Jack and show it to him today.
Son, can I,
Oh, yeah, Daddy?
he won't be there. Do you remember how we talked about your Uncle Jack? He died.
Oh, yeah, well, Elmo can just show it to Uncle Jack next time.
Well, I'm afraid not, son.
Elmo can call him on the phone, right?
No, son. You see, when someone dies, it means they're not alive anymore. Their body has stopped working. They don't eat or breathe or talk on the phone. Uncle Jack died.
It's so hard to get used to the idea that someone you love just isn't going to be there.
Yeah. I was very sad and mad because I knew he wasn't going to be here anymore and I just didn't know what to do.
Sometimes we would scream in the pillow. We would just put the pillow up to our faces and just scream, just so that you could get it all out.
One of my teachers, she had lost her dad too, and she said that she would always write letters to him. And then I started writing letters, and that made me feel better.
My dad was really funny and likable and had a lot of friends.
My dad was a helicopter pilot in the Marine Corps. He had to deploy a lot, and he'd be gone for like months at a time.
How do you tell an 8-year-old and a 10-year-old that their dad has made it safely back from Iraq and then taken his own life?
I think the best way to cope with feelings is to just talk to somebody and just say everything that you're feeling and why you're feeling that. And like, it's like a towel. If it's wet, it's going to weigh you down. You need to wring it out.
We do a lot of things to try to keep his memory alive. He's everywhere, really. He's in the ocean and he's in the sky.
And my dad was a major, so we named the dog Major. Major was born on the anniversary of his death. So many connections all around us that really keeps him here, I think.
I know the times are sad. Don't know how you make it through. Someone you love is gone forever. Think of the time you had and remember a love so true. Sharing the memories that help me too.
'Cause our hearts will just go wander by remembering.
And our love will always find new heights to climb. When someone you love is gone, you are always going to find that you need to give your heart a little time. You need to give your heart a little time.
So the last, I want to end with the impact of this work that we've had. Probably the most significant thing for us is the impact that this work has had on families, and we continue to hear from people actually all over the world that this work is having a difference in their lives and their kids' lives. And if you can see from this quote here, I'm going to read it very quickly. My daughter was 3.5 when my husband died from cancer. After he died, she did not want to talk about Daddy at all. She didn't want to look at his picture either. One night we sat together and watched when families grieved. She was excited to see Elmo and all of her favorite characters. Then she saw other kids whose daddy had died. I told her it's okay to be sad. Her eyes got big. Then she started crying for the first time. She said, I miss Daddy so much. Mommy, did you make him die? Did the doctors make him die? Mommy, you aren't going to die, are you? We hugged and cried together for a while. We talked about how Daddy was so sick his body wouldn't work anymore that the doctors tried to help him. Since that night, she takes down her Daddy's picture and hugs and kisses it often. She talks about the fun things Daddy did, and sometimes she cries and just misses her Daddy. This program was the door opener I needed to talk to my precious daughter. Thank you. And there are no better words that can be given to us based on this work. So the last slide is, I beg all of you who feel like this could be a resource for you, for the people you work with, for your community, we have these resources. They are available for free. We can send them to you for free. We do not want them sitting on our shelves. We want them being used. We want them making a difference in as many people as possible, lives as possible. So please email us at this email address here, and I thank you for your time.
we can continue to the next.
Thank you so much, Lynn. And if you order those kits, you will be able to view the video in its entirety, and I assure you it's well worth watching. It's wonderful, as are all of the other Sesame products that you'll receive in those kits. Next, we're going to hear from Robin, who's going to talk about the NCTSN resources that are available for school-aged children who are experiencing grief and traumatic grief and their caregivers.
Thank you, Judy. I think we're on the slide called You Are Not Alone, Helping Children with Traumatic Grief, NCTSN Educational Materials. And first I just want to say that, it's really such an honor to be presenting with everyone, especially Elmo. He's a tough act to follow. And it reminds me of what Mr. Rogers supposedly said once, which is anything mentionable is manageable. And I think that that's really the theme that we want to kind of carry through this whole presentation about, kids just need the help from adults to talk about whatever is out there in their world, and hopefully this will help people be able to do that. In talking about the materials that the National Child Traumatic Stress Network and specifically the Childhood Traumatic Grief Task Force and Committee has created, we had a few things in mind. I think no matter what the issues, first is we think if you can kind of present it in the right way, then kids can learn how to deal with it. But that sometimes means helping the adults learn how to present it and talk about it. And information is really important and key to empowering people. We think, in many ways it demystifies situations, it destigmatizes something like grief, which, if you remember back to Renee's slide of the hear no evil, see no evil, think no evil, and how death is so much a taboo subject in all of society, and especially for children. And information also can sensitize people to what these issues are, rather than frighten them. So the goals with our materials really are to help the people that are helping children recognize what might be going on for a child who's grieving, know what to do in terms of how to respond to those children appropriately, and teenagers as well, and then ultimately to help children realize that it's a good thing and it's okay to remember the person who died. Next slide, please. Educational materials for caregivers and children. So I'm going to go through a bunch of different ones that we have and highlight a few of them for you. So, next slide. It's okay to remember. And this was really one of our first big projects that we undertook. It was really quite remarkable in terms of the collaboration that went into it. It was based on researchers and clinicians as well as families themselves to really produce something that was going to be useful for a variety of different audiences. And It's Okay to Remember is a video, and it provides a moving first-person narrative about what a family goes through. And this was actually a family that went through treatment for childhood traumatic grief. And they, in their own words, talk about what that was like. And their daughter, it was a child who died, and so it was a little girl whose sibling died. And in the video, she's grown up a little bit and is much more mature than she was when she first went through the experience. But they talk about all the aspects of that experience and what they did to kind of get past and get through and cope with their grief in this very particular kind of situation where the child had died a very traumatic death by falling off of a balcony in the house. And we also, in addition to that video, there's a video for professionals to watch that has some of the same pieces included into it. And there's a whole kit that's called The Courage to Remember, and it provides additional written information and help for people that want to actually provide intervention for kids and families. Next slide. Traumatic grief, general information. So we have information for parents, and there's, downloadable handouts, and it talks about, many of the things that Renee talked about in terms of what is the typical course of grieving for children and what happens when it's not so typical and they may be having a traumatic reaction. And since the original publication of those materials, we've added them in Spanish, which has been a terrific addition, and I'm sure many of us wish we could put them in, even more languages. And, recently we've added additional resources for caregivers and children and teens. And what this provides is bibliographies and a list of different print materials that we use. We gathered materials that we could find from all different professionals and what they use and what their favorites are and their top 10 books and what was still available. And then for the children and teens to really provide books, because, there's nothing better than sometimes, if, the Sesame Street materials, speak to, is sitting down, caregiver and child together to look at something or view something or read something. And so that resource for children and teens actually is annotated, and it's divided by age. So, if you are a caregiver and your 5-year-old is experiencing some grief and you want to know a book you can get at your local library or the bookstore, you can go and pick out what you think might be appropriate. So that's a way for families to kind of take the time and really kind of take it as much time as they need to go through something to understand what they're going through, whether it's typical grief or a more traumatic reaction. Next slide. Traumatic grief and sibling death and unconfirmed death. We realize that, death is not a one-size-fits-all, one situation, and although we all come up with bullet points or talking points for things, every family is different. And there are some situations that, do present different kind of issues or situations or challenges for families. Although there's many similarities for a child who's grieving the death of a parent or a sibling or a grandpa, there are some unique features for different kinds of death. Sibling death is one of those where children, when they have a sibling die, may face other kinds of feelings and emotions, such as guilt or feeling responsible. But then there's also changes in the whole family routine and dynamics, and sometimes you went from being a younger sister to now an only child, or you have parents that are kind of figuring out how to possibly replace that child, or there's now more pressure, responsibility that you feel. So there are, those information sheets provide, kind of a insight into some of those very different kind of situations that siblings and those families may face. So it's coping with an unconfirmed death. Again, many similarities to other kinds of deaths and situations. But here you may have a situation where a body isn't found, or, the death may not even be confirmed. So even if maybe you know that someone drowned but they never did recover the body, or, something like 9/11. So again, lots of times that you'll have different family members reacting in very different kinds of ways in terms of kind of some thinking that the person may still be alive, and others in the family in a very different place. So we provide some guidelines and information about that. Next slide. And as Lynn pointed out, the military is a very unique situation, and we think they certainly, kind of deserve some special attention, all the time, but certainly when they're faced with the death of one of their family members. And, they have, again, personal kinds of struggles that, other people that are not military face sometimes. And, again, we thought it was important for those families to know that we understand those struggles. We also think it's important for the people that are helping military families to understand what that culture is, what that system is, and what are the unique aspects of those kinds of deaths. Everything from it being public in terms of, news and information about war and people's political views, to the very private things that sometimes are just so hidden, and outsiders sometimes don't understand what that culture is like or what a military burial is like, and what those families might be facing when they have to move off of a base or lose that military identity in certain ways. Next slide. And this is just a picture of what one of those information sheets look like. And actually these sheets are, downloadable, and there's, sometimes 5, 6, 10 pages long, and you can pick and choose what you want to use. Then the next slide, ready to remember. And you see, a lot of what we did, and actually the majority of what we did was focused on caregivers and professionals and the people that are involved in the lives of children. And in talking to professionals and caregivers, we also learned there's nothing for the children themselves, especially when it came to understanding the situation about a traumatic death or a traumatic grief. We're happy to say that there's all sorts of books out there and resources when it's kind of a more typical reaction. And, everybody has their favorites, whether it's, a book based with animals or a grandparent or the life cycle. And we really wanted to focus on those, that small percentage, but, important percentage of kids that are struggling in these ways that Renee talked about in the beginning of the presentation. So Ready to Remember tells the story of a 10-year-old boy's experience after the tragic death of his father. We never give the cause of death because we want it to be universal and applicable to so many different kinds of kids. And Jeremy is having a traumatic reaction, and he's struggling at school and at home. And it's developed in school-age reader, and there's a caregiver guide, so that there's points that we think are important for a caregiver to understand, and what we do is we refer to a particular page in the book so that they understand, oh, this is what that means, so they can, understand and speak to it even more accurately and knowledgeably with their kids. And the idea is, by the end of the book, Jeremy has kind of gone through an experience and gotten help, and he's able to deal with those happy memories and do what we think is necessary when a child is having a traumatic reaction. So I'm going to read a few pages from the book. This is not the whole book, and again, the book is downloadable from the NCTSN.org website, and it's beautifully illustrated, and anybody can get a copy of it, but I'm just going to read a few of the pages to illustrate, and to hopefully illustrate some of the things about the other kinds of reactions kids can have when it's more traumatic. Next slide, please. So Ready to Remember, Jeremy's Journey of Hope and Healing. Next slide. Jeremy loved art. It has always been his favorite subject in school, but lately the 10-year-old boy couldn't even pick up a paintbrush. Today in art class, he just stared at his blank paper. Do you need some ideas for your sketch, Mr. Davis asked. No, I just don't feel like drawing, Jeremy replied. The boy's artwork used to cover the walls of the classroom. Now Jeremy just didn't seem interested. I'd rather read my book, he told Mr. Davis. So you kind of might think he's having a typical reaction or just kind of having a bad day, and then we learn more. Next slide. After school, Jeremy's mother picked up Jeremy and his younger brother. Brandon jumped into the back seat. Jeremy's brother was in second grade. He turned 8 3 months ago, just a few weeks before that horrible day. It's the weekend, yelled Brandon. Friday's here. Finally warming up, said their mother. Do you boys want to go to the skate park tomorrow? Yes, said Brandon. I can't, Jeremy said, looking out the window. I need to study. But it's the weekend. You can take some time out for a little fun, can't you, honey? Asked Jeremy's mom. No, Jeremy said. I have a math test coming up. Don't you remember that I got a C- on the last one? Jeremy's grades were way down. Until recently, he always got straight A's in school. That's okay, Jeremy, said Brandon. We can skateboard another time. The key here is that what we're doing is showing how Brandon is really having a very kind of typical reaction and kind of thinking about his dad, and Jeremy is really struggling, and his grades are struggling. All those things that may not be a red flag until you put it all together with a child that suffered a traumatic death. And so we really want to point out what this looks like in real life. We actually also had some kids and adults read the draft of the book to see if it was accurate, and they kind of thought it really hit it home. So, next slide. When they got home, Jeremy went straight to his room. His brother followed him. Hey, Joe, do you want to play a video game or something? Brandon asked, maybe, said Jeremy. Brandon was excited. Cool, let's play the one Dad gave me for my birthday. Let's go downstairs. Hold on, Jeremy said, changing my I'm not in the mood. I really want to finish my book. Brandon looked at his big brother. He loved hanging out with Jeremy, but lately he felt like a big pest. Jeremy always wanted to be alone. His friends didn't even come over. So you see the withdrawal and the avoidance and the really kind of not engaging in what are the typical developmental tasks that he should be like his brother is. And again, some of those things that Renee was talking about earlier. Next slide. And again, I'm skipping a lot of pages. Has to get you interested in going and downloading the whole book. So here, at dinner that night, the boy's mom served homemade pizza. Here's a piece, Mom? Popping a piece of pepperoni into his mouth. Do you guys remember that time last year when Dad was making one of his super-duper pizzas? He threw the pizza dough in the air like real pizza chefs do, but it landed on that toaster. Brandon laughed the memory, and he just scraped it off and used it. Gross! The mom laughed along with Brendan. Jeremy jumped up from the table, knocking a glass of juice on the floor. Why do you two keep talking about Dad? He yelled. Haven't you noticed he's not here anymore? Who cares about some stupid pizza he made? Jeremy didn't want to hear stories about his dad. He missed him too much. Why couldn't his mother and brother understand that? Jeremy, his mother called out, I'm not hungry. Going upstairs to read, Jeremy said as he dashed his room and slammed the door behind him. Again, we see that avoidance, that re-experiencing when they're triggered by a memory can lead to anger and might not be interpreted correctly. It might be, oh, he's difficult or he's acting out, but actually these things are happening around issues and reminders of his dad. Next slide. So we skip through to now, this is a smart mom and realizes he needs to get some help, and finally he's getting some help. And one way he gets some help in the book is by seeing a counselor, but also a friend, somebody he knows is also kind of had traumatic grief and is kind of helping him show him the ropes a little bit. I remember one time after my mom died, when my dad wanted me to clean my room, Elena continued, I don't know why that made me mad. I slammed my door so hard that picture fell off the wall. My dad was upset and he said, your mother would know what to do. That just made me madder. But instead of yelling, I started crying. And then what you see as we go through here, and we show and talk about how Jeremy's learning relaxation techniques with his therapist, and he practices them at home. Because one thing we also think about in terms of helping these children with the kind of work that Judy and her colleagues have developed is that it's best when the caregiver is involved too, and so that there's monitoring and help all along the way outside of the therapist or counselor's office. And so here he is practicing. Next slide. Finally, Jeremy did talk to the counselors about his dad, and then it shows how Jeremy is slowly remembering and able to talk about his dad. Next slide. I'm skipping so that Andrea has plenty of time. In school, Jeremy began drawing again. One day he drew a portrait of his dad wearing the funny tie that Jeremy had hand-painted for Father's Day when he was in first grade. When he showed the picture to his mother, he saw that she had tears in her eyes. I'm sorry if it upsets you, Mom, Jeremy said. Oh, no, honey, I love it, his mom replied, wiping a tear. So again, we want to show that it's not about never being sad, it's about having those memories. And that, again, the art now can come back into his life because it's not the trigger that it used to be once he's learned how to handle it. Next slide. The counselor suggested to me that Jeremy and his brothers think of a way to honor their father's birthday that summer. The boys decided to have a pizza party and to make one of their father's super-duper pizzas with everything on it. Jeremy invited Elena to the party. Again, you see him come full circle where now those things that were terrible memories in terms of triggers are now positive, and he's able to use them in a different kind of a way. And so, again, it's kind of to help open up that conversation with a child and really for a caregiver to recognize and be sensitive to what's going on and when a child might need more help. And last slide, additional resources. So besides the book and all the other resources I talked about, if you go to the NCTSN.org website under traumatic grief, you'll see there's all sorts of materials also for counselors, mental health professionals, to learn how to do this kind of work with kids who may be suffering a traumatic reaction, as well as school personnel, so someone can download it and hand it to a teacher or a guidance counselor and say, look, this is what's going on. He's having a hard time. It's not that he's, being lazy. And pediatricians and pediatric nurses who really sometimes are on the front line when they have those kids with their physical complaints and realize that maybe something else is going on. So thank you, and I'm turning it over to Andrea.
Thank you, Robin. And Judy, thank you for pulling us all together to talk about these wonderful resources. And I'm just reflecting, thinking about how important it is for all of us that when we are in pain, it is so helpful to hear stories told in a language that we understand, that resonates with us, to hear our story in some ways told by others. It can just be such a tremendous relief. So I'm so pleased to watch some of these resources be developed and put out there. And I have read the whole book, Robin, and it is quite good. So thank you. So good afternoon. And I wanted to say a little bit that, it is not an accident that we have a webinar today entitled You Are Not Alone. It's not an accident that it's happening this particular week. This panel and this topic were put together in part to recognize a relatively new but growing initiative that we're calling Children's Grief Awareness Day, which this year will be held Thursday, November 17th. So in 2 days, everyone, this will be the day we observe. This event has been observed now for 4 years, and each year we hold it the Thursday before Thanksgiving, because what Judy was saying is so true. This time of year can be especially hard for children who are grieving the death of a family member, as everyone begins to get ready for the holidays and thinking about family and friends and togetherness. That hole, that empty seat of this person missing can really be painful. And so this is a time of year we want to show extra support for children who are grieving. I'd like to take some time today to explain what Children's Grief Awareness Day is and how it came about. And to do so, let me back up and give you some background. I'm with the program called the Highmark Caring Place, which provides peer support programming for children of all ages and their families after children have experienced the death of a family member. And for those of you who work with children or even know a child who has experienced the death of someone who is significant to them, we know from their point of view that if I'm 5 and my dad dies, or I'm 8 and my mom dies, and I lose a beloved big brother or grandparent, it's devastating. It's your worst fear come true. And Dr. Dominguez did a beautiful job describing in rich detail the many feelings and thoughts and experiences that children have when they are missing someone very terribly, when they're trying to wrap their arms around someone being gone forever. It's confusing and it's frightening. Grief brings intense feelings and thoughts. Many, you don't even know how to put them into words yet. Children miss the person, they miss their family and the way it was, and families do change quite dramatically after a death. Surviving caregivers, even in their most heartfelt attempts at being available to their children, in the midst of your grief, sometimes you're quite tapped out. And I know I've heard many children talk about wanting to protect their other family members. They want to be strong. And so there's this, just like Renee was saying about the myths, there's a sense that if I talk about this, I'm going to make my mom cry, I'm going to make my brother cry, and somehow make it worse. And so they hold many feelings inside. And so what we hear is in the midst of grief, children feel alone. And they feel like they're the only ones who have experienced such a loss. And this aloneness and isolation can be yet another piece of their experience that adds to their pain or intensifies their grief. I think this happens for a number of reasons. I know in our family and in our culture, after the death of someone, everyone comes from out of town, friends and family gather. There's such rich support immediately after a family member dies. But soon, after several weeks, people return to their lives. And for the family who is grieving, as that reality is just beginning to sink in that the person is gone, everyone has kind of gone back to their daily lives. And families feel, in some ways, emotionally dropped. Children have often talked with me about how different they feel from their peers and their friends. even best friends and even good friends at school have difficulty knowing what to say or how to support their friends. They're afraid of saying the wrong thing. They're hesitant. Is it okay to joke? What do I say? And so in their hesitancy and in their awkwardness, they will sometimes not say anything. We've also heard the other end of the spectrum that kids at school can be fairly mean to kids who are grieving. I think it's in their wish to distance themselves or kind of think, boy, I hope this doesn't happen to me, but many of the children I work with talk about being teased and made fun of, that if something like this could happen to you, you must have somehow deserved it, or there's something less than about you. And so that can be very hurtful. So I think as we're working with children and being very mindful of that particular relationship they're grieving and missing, these children also belong to families and they belong to social worlds that are changing dramatically as well. And that's why the theme of this webinar, You Are Not Alone, is so powerful, because that is just how these children and families are feeling. And it's those kinds of experiences that have led to programs like The Caring Place, which are programs based on peer support models, where children have the opportunity to be with other children who understand what they're going through because they too have experienced a loss. And so together they create a very emotionally safe place and begin to approach some of those bereavement tasks that Renee described. So sitting across from another teenager, what a relief it is to be able to tell my story to a group of peers that are listening very intently to what I'm saying and saying, wow, some of that happened to me too, or actually it was different for me. Let me tell you my story. And so in this sharing of thoughts and feelings, there can be, a great sense of camaraderie and comfort and support. So these kinds of programs have become a very powerful resource for families, and there are many of these kinds of programs that are developing across the country. And so just wanting to make you all aware of that families can find this kind of support very helpful, and it is a different kind of support from a more clinical or therapeutic kind of intervention. So from our point of view, the question then becomes, what else can we do to alleviate some of this sense of alienation and aloneness? How can we expand this ring of support outside the walls of a program or a clinic or a therapist's office out into the community? Now, how can we assist teachers and nurses, coaches, neighbors, coworkers? How can we help all of them become more aware of the impact of grief on children and be responsive to their need for support, to be mindful that for children, grief is real, it's intense, and it doesn't just go away. So on my second slide, 4 years ago, actually in partnership with one of the schools we work closely with, the suggestion came up, why don't we have a day that we dedicate to the issue of grieving children? Why don't we make this an issue that is important enough to have its own day? And we thought that was a very good idea and established Children's Grief Awareness Day. We chose the third Thursday of November, and our intention is to keep this date moving forward. So the date might change, but that Thursday before Thanksgiving, that third Thursday of November, is going to be consistent. And it is a day, as this flyer suggests, it is a day focused on bringing to mind and showing support for the children around us who have experienced the death of a loved one. The number of people involved in this day and the kinds of activities and events taking place have grown each year. It's really taken off and is quite exciting. Schools, businesses, funeral homes we've been working with, political leaders, celebrities. You'll see Heinz Ward up on our website if you take a look. Children and families, many people and groups are joining this initiative. I've also learned recently that many of the programs associated with the National Alliance for Grieving Children are spreading information in their own respective communities and using it as a way to bring awareness more locally to their communities and making sure that the families and children in their communities find the support they need. And our hope is to gather state and national support for this issue and date and eventually have it be a national day of observance that belongs to all of us. So we're taking every opportunity to encourage people and families and organizations to observe this day in some way. If you look at the next slide, most simply, we are encouraging everyone to wear blue and to tell people why they are wearing blue on that day. To tell them, I'm wearing blue to support children who have been through a loss because someone in their life has died. With the advent and explosion of social media, we have been able to use this tool to bring this message into areas we never would have been able to 5 or 10 years ago. So for any of you who are on the website or who are on Facebook, we do have a Facebook called Children's Grief Awareness Day, and you can see that located at the bottom of these slides. You know, if you Google or just search Children's Grief Awareness Day, you will find the relevant places on the Internet. And when you're on this site, you will see quite a bit of information that we've put on about Children's Grief Awareness Day. There's a toolkit. There are ideas on what you can do to observe that day. You'll see templates, sample letters, announcement sound bites, things like that that people can pick and choose as they like what makes sense to them. The next slide is on our Facebook page. You will also see people holding on to a picture of this butterfly. And this is our butterfly, and we have named her Hope. And holding on to hope is our most recent initiative because we were wanting something tangible to do to connect with this issue that carries beyond the particular day. The idea behind this is we want children to literally hold on to hope that even after something so tragic, after the death of a family member, it's not always going to hurt so much. And we're asking people to print out a copy of Hope, take it with them, take it to some place that matters to you, and hold on to hope. And take a picture of yourself holding on to hope. And we're asking people to put those pictures on our Facebook page. And you will see directions for that once you go onto the site. We're trying to get as many pictures up on our Facebook page as we can. And how powerful it will be that children will be able to log onto this site and see so many people holding on to hope for them. Maybe people they don't even know saying, we support you, we care about what's going on for you, and we want to be understanding and sensitive to what this is like for you. If you look at the next couple of slides, and whoever is working the slides, just to show a few of these, you can see that Hope has been to some pretty amazing places. I'm a little bit jealous of Hope, but Hope has been to Times Square and the Eiffel Tower. Hope has been high in the sky, skydiving, and to birthday parties and weddings. So what we're hoping that people do is, after they upload their picture, to think about someone in their life who may be needing hope, maybe someone who's struggling, maybe someone who's hurting, and give them hope. Give them a picture of the butterfly and say, hey, I've been thinking about you. We found many children have resonated with this idea and have gone on, even in their own heartache, have thought about others who are hurting and wanting to spread that sentiment. These photos that you're looking at are just a very small collection of some of the heartwarming photos that you might be able to access online, and I really encourage you to view them. The last slide is a way to explain where has Hope been so far, and actually this is outdated because I understand as of today Hope was in Australia. So Hope has been to 6 continents, and many, many places that would be unexpected. I've even seen pictures of Hope in Iraq and Afghanistan. So it's, in a way, it's kind of a fun thing to do, but also quite poignant. I think that it's so important for children who may be feeling alone in their grief to have a chance to experience this outpouring of support. So if you know of a child who's grieving, show them this site or give them a butterfly and tell them why you're giving it to them. I think that as I reflect on this day, the various presentations and the rich resources that are being developed and distributed to professionals and families and the general public, these are such powerful ways all of us can advocate for children and families that we serve, and a way to make this issue belong to all of us. So we do have the potential to build safer and more responsive communities and a culture that is supportive for children who are hurting. And so very proud to be part of this kind of work. And thank you for your attention today.
Thank you, Andrea, and I'd like to thank all of our presenters. And just in closing, say that the work that all of you and all of us are doing in the NCTSN are just trying to further the message that grieving children and traumatically bereaved children, what we want to tell you and your families, you are not alone. You don't have to go through this journey alone, and we're there for you. So thank you, everyone, for joining us.